Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you very much for joining us today for a Generation UCAN webinar on marathon fueling, half marathon fueling, and training. I'm Varn Schreier, I'm your host. Thrilled to be joined by Michelle Hearn, registered dietitian, sub 3 hour marathoner. Michelle's a wealth of knowledge on all things running and nutrition. Michelle, thank you so much for being with us today.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me.
We're going to have a great conversation here over the next 45 minutes or so as we really look to hone in on the best ways to train with UCAN for your marathon and half marathon. You notice I start with train with UCAN because that's a really important component. And then we're certainly also going to talk about how to use it on race day. And for everybody who's joining us tonight who's running the Navy Air Force half on September 18th in DC, welcome. We are thrilled to be the on-course nutrition for the Navy Air Force half. So we certainly will talk about where specifically on the race course for that race we'll be serving UCAN and give you guys specifics on what you can expect on race day. But with that, Michelle, let's get started. I always like to, kick things off with you kind of by getting your story. How did you come to UCAN? How were you introduced to the product?
Yeah, so I actually saw an advertisement, gosh, I think it was back in 2013 on Let's Run, and it talked about how this was a slow burning carbohydrate product, and it was very different than, the traditional sports drinks, the Gatorades, Powerades, Goos, and what the product was claiming was that it would keep your blood sugar and energy stable with significantly less calories, and that was so counterintuitive to what I knew as a dietitian and an athlete. I was intrigued and quite skeptical. But I, purchased the product and tried it and was just amazed by the results.
So you alluded to the fact that this was different than what you were traditionally thought, and that's a great place to start our discussion, Michelle. We teased a little bit of that idea with UCAN, but let's set a little bit of the context in terms of what runners have traditionally done and what endurance athletes have traditionally done. And, kind of before we introduce what has been traditionally done, some of the keys to running success when we talk about how to have a good race day experience or what you're trying to achieve in your training, it really can boil down to these three things. The number one aspect, which you'll hear Michelle and I talk about time and time again over the next 45 minutes, is stable blood sugar. That is key to managing your energy levels and so much more. The second idea that you'll definitely hear us explore is becoming better at fat burning. That's one of the big keys to improving your endurance training, your overall fitness and performance is becoming more effective on being able to also burn fat and not so reliant just on carbohydrates and sugar. And then, of course, the third thing, and you can really flip flop these. Some would actually put number three up at the top is a happy stomach. I mean, Michelle, in your experience, working with runners like you do, or with yourself, I mean, how finicky can the stomach get, and how important is having a happy stomach to overall success?
Oh, when I first saw these, I agree with you. I was thinking a happy stomach might even be number one because I think if you had the others and all of a sudden you have terrible stomach cramps or diarrhea, like it's off, and it's there's nothing more upsetting than when you've trained really hard and you feel like you have your nutrition down pat, and then you go into a race or a long training run and your stomach just is all over the place. Like it can really ruin it can ruin your training and certainly can ruin your race day.
And in talking to runners and coaches, I would say more coaches, across the country, I mean, they keep coming back to that as being one of the biggest issues that runners face that can really sabotage their race day performance. And for a lot of folks, it's kind of one of the biggest variables too. If you haven't gotten the nutrition just right, or if you're really relying on a lot of these sugar-based fuels, that happy stomach can be something that you can never quite, exactly are able to nail. So there's certainly a great tie-in with UCAN there, and that's something we'll get to. But in terms of what's traditionally been taught to runners, in terms of fueling, there's always been an emphasis on these fast-acting, high glycemic carbohydrates. So your pastas, bagels, breads, rices. I mean, these are staples. Whether it's the pre-race dinner or before or after a race, it's always been very dependent on these carbohydrates that enter your system quickly. Michelle, as a dietitian and as someone who's probably experienced these effects, what do you see as the flaw with relying on these types of foods as your primary energy source?
Yeah, so like you kind of alluded to, we've been taught that you need carbohydrates before, carbohydrates during, carbohydrates after, carbohydrates throughout the day. And the problem with that is you really teach your body to be completely dependent on carbohydrates, especially during runs or races. Traditional nutrition, our sports nutrition knowledge has told us we need to be taking in, anywhere between 100 and 200 calories, depending on your weight every 30 to 45 minutes. And if you're going to be out on a half marathon or marathon course for a long time, they're telling you to have 3 to 400 calories, mostly carbohydrates, before your run. Then, every 15 to 45 minutes during your run, more carbohydrates, more carbohydrates. So, once you're really prone to those blood sugar spikes and crashes, and I'm sure we're going to talk a little bit more about that when you're constantly fueling on carbohydrates. You're also really prone to having a lot of stomach distress. I worked with a lot of runners who tell me like, gosh, my stomach, I can't do those goos and gels, but if I don't take them, then I feel just a crash in energy. So you're kind of darned if you do, darned if you don't. So they don't really set you up um, to have that steady, consistent energy. There's certainly a better way to fuel.
And even, Michelle, what you were just talking about with from a sports nutrition standpoint, if we're separating that from, the bagel, the pre-race bagel, or the pre-night, the night before pasta, from a sports nutrition and fueling standpoint, when we're talking about pre and during, it's always been very sugar dependent, correct? You already talked about some of the flaws in that, but what's the challenge and the issue that runners face when they're relying on these sugar-based sports nutrition products?
Well, the first thing that we talked a little about is certainly the sports, the Gatorades, the Powerades. There's when you flip it over on the back, you're going to see some form of sugar, whether it's sucrose, glucose, fructose, and they're always coming out with something new. People bring me the label. It's like, oh, this isn't sugar, it's brown rice syrup. It's a different form of sugar. So once again, I think one of the first ones certainly is that it's going to cause stomach distress. But also, most people don't realize anytime you take in a very like processed flour, say like a bagel or a goo or gel, something very dense in sugar, immediately right after you take that, it causes your blood sugar to rise. And when your blood sugar rises, you switch your body's ability to be able to burn fat for fuel. You basically switch that off. So we all, even super lean people, have a lot of stored body fat that we can use for fuel. It can allow us to run or do any type of endurance activity, very consistently, very evenly. But when we take in these sugars, not only are we, prone to causing, gastric distress, we suppress our body's ability to use fat for fuel. And so now you're basically completely dependent on these sugar products.
And Michelle, one of the things you mentioned, which has become more and more prevalent, actually, this really speaks well to what you were just talking about.
Hmm.
Taking in those sugars. I think a lot of it is illustrated here. It's going to cause that big spike, and then with that spike comes the GI distress. With that spike also comes a large reaction from the hormone insulin, which is going to tell your body to store fat rather than burn it. So, these sugar-based fuels, they have several effects that are hindering, the things we identified, which are the keys to running success, whether it's happy stomach, whether it's being better at burning fat, or, whether it's keeping your blood sugar stable. The traditional method of fueling is not supporting these. Now, we've talked about the spike, Michelle, as illustrated here, that there's also ill effects both in, in terms of performance and how runners are feeling caused by the sugar crash. What happens? What do we feel when we get that big drop after that big initial spike?
Yeah, and I'm sure a lot of people listening can relate to this. Maybe you've had a bagel, or you've had, a couple granola bars, and you go out for a run. And maybe after about an hour or so, if you don't take any fuel, you start to feel that sugar crash. You're going to start to feel a little dizzy, a little sweaty. Um, it's a terrible feeling. Yeah, and most of the time you're going to have to slow down. Sometimes you may have to completely stop. And the only way to basically get out of that is to consume more sugar. So you're really setting yourself for, a negative spike, a negative performance. But it's a really unkind thing to do to your body over and over again, just from a metabolism standpoint. You're basically constantly, spiking your blood sugar, stopping your body from burning fat. You're getting this crash. And as you can also see in this graph, you're releasing cortisol and epinephrine, all these stress hormones. And then, as a result, you're basically having to have more sugar to get out of that crash. So It's really it's not only not a good way for athletic performance, it's a really poor way to fuel for health.
And that's such a critical point because I think if we look at the reality, I mean, everybody who's training for these races certainly wants to perform as best as they can and run as fast as they can. And that the beauty of running is that you're constantly able to compete against yourself and race against the clock and try to set that new PR. But the reality is most of the folks we're speaking to and most of the folks signing up for these races are in the sport for long-term fitness and as you alluded to, long-term health, Michelle. So the this constant fluctuation in blood sugars. You talked a little bit about it, but what are some of the health risks that this can set people up for? Even people who may look lean and perceive themselves as healthy. What are some of the long term health implications of constantly riding this up and down wave of blood sugar?
Yeah, this is basically how people get, type 2 diabetes. You're constantly taking in high sugar, high flour foods, causing your blood sugar to rise. Your pancreas has to secrete insulin, blood sugar crashes, so you take in more sugar. So when you ride that cycle over and over again, you're overworking your pancreas, and after a while, your body can stop being as sensitive to those blood sugar spikes. So I'd like to, another good example people can think of is how many times have we been to a marathon or half marathon, or maybe somebody listening to this can directly relate to this. You're running all these miles and you're training and you feel like you're eating well, but you're not losing weight. It used to be amazing to me that people running 50, 60, maybe even more miles could be struggling to actually to lose weight. Like traditional nutrition would tell us, well, it's calories in versus calories out. But what I found as a dietitian, there's a lot of runners, they were taking in carbohydrates before they ran, so they were stopping their body from burning fat. They were taking in lots of those goos and gels during running, so once again, suppressing their body burning fat during running. And then as soon as they were done running, they were taking in, chocolate milk or those, very high glycemic carbohydrates. So the entire time they were running, they were not only suppressing their body's ability to use fat for fuel, they were consuming a ton of sugar, which in turn, some of it gets deposited as fat. And then throughout the rest of the day, they were eating a ton of carbohydrates because they thought that's what they were supposed to do to fuel their running. So, it really all comes back around full circle. And I'm sure we'll talk a little bit more about this as we go on.
Yeah, and that's I think for you, Michelle, both being a dietitian and a runner. I mean, I think that's the unique perspective you bring. That you're not only approaching this from a performance standpoint because you're always trying to get better and faster yourself, but you're also approaching this with the clients you work with from a health standpoint. So it's a great perspective you offer just there. So moving on, one of the things you talked about, Michelle, is when people are always bringing you different products and showing you what's on the back of the label, whether it's brown rice syrup and kind of trying to understand, is this sugar? How is this different? What's it doing to my body? And one of the most common things, the kind of the cheats on the label, I guess you would say, is a carbohydrate maltodextrin, which is what's the most common energy source found in most sports nutrition products. And if you'll look at the back of the label on any product with maltodextrin, it's not going to be counted as sugar. So you might think that hey, this is good. I'm consuming less sugar. And to be clear, so when maltodextrin came out on the market as a quote unquote complex carbohydrate in the 90s, it was it was absolutely considered in many ways an improvement over your simple sugars, your sucrose or fructose, because it was a more complex structure, thus making it easier on the stomach. But so people might think of it as a quote unquote complex carbohydrate. But Michelle, from a blood sugar standpoint, what is maltodextrin doing to our system?
Yeah, maltodextrin actually causes a higher blood sugar spike than just pure table sugar. You're correct in that it is a bigger molecule. It is more complex than say like a sucrose. But unfortunately, yeah, it's a little bit misleading because if you flip over, something that's primarily maltodextrin, say like goo, I believe it's either zero sugar or maybe very few sugars. So you'll think, oh wow, great, this is complex, but the the effect it has on your blood sugar is actually worse than sugar. It's going to spike you higher. It would be it would be something that would be very effective if, somebody was going into like a hypoglycemic, type 1 insulin crash. But other than that, it certainly isn't the best choice for, during exercise, before exercise, or after exercise.
And yeah, I think that's one of the points you raised, Michelle. With any of these products, certainly there might be specific times and places that people might find them to be beneficial, or perhaps what you just described, or maybe towards the end of a marathon when you just feel like you need a little bit of that boost to that more quicker boost to get you through the final miles. But what we're really talking about here is trying to get people away from using these types of products and relying on sugars as the staple of their training, and so that's certainly the way we're approaching this. It shouldn't be something that's going to be consistent use, throughout your training, and that's being used very frequently over and over and over. So, we've kind of set the table for the way different carbohydrates impact your blood sugar, and why you should care about your blood sugar. So let's talk about how UCAN is very different. And just to be clear, UCAN is a carbohydrate, and we're going to talk about this. And so we're not saying that you don't need any carbohydrates to run. That's not at all that we're saying. But what we are talking about here is that the quality of carbohydrate that you consume and the way a carbohydrate impacts your blood sugar is going to be very, very much, how your energy levels or it's going to impact your energy levels. It's going to impact the fuels you burn, and it's going to impact your health and fitness. So how is UCAN completely different? I think one of the ways to really understand UCAN is to understand the origins of the carbohydrate in UCAN, which we call superstarch. So superstarch is a low glycemic, it's a very complex starch, and it was developed for a very specific purpose. Our founder's son, Jonah, who you see here on the screen, he suffers from a life-threatening blood sugar disease. So from the time he was born, Jonah had to eat or be fed every 90 minutes to 2 hours to maintain his blood sugar. These kids had a genetic defect where they were unable to break down carbohydrates and convert them into glucose to give them energy. So if they weren't fed, a very specific amount of carbohydrate at frequent intervals, they would get severely hypoglycemic, or their blood sugar would drop, and this could result in life-threatening seizures. So from the time Jonah was born, his family, they were living really a life by the clock, waking up every 2 hours in the middle of the night to feed their son, setting multiple alarm clocks, because if they missed the feeding, it could be disastrous. So Jonah's family, they were very proactive, and knowing that this was a very stressful way to continue life, and very risky for them as well, they started really funding research and spearheading research, looking at all different types of carbohydrate sources that would break down slowly and steadily over a long period of time, and give Jonah that slow burn of energy that he really needed to keep his blood sugar steady throughout the night. And this is ultimately where they discovered superstarch, which is what is the key ingredient in UCAN, which is what's completely unique to UCAN products. And those of you that have used UCAN may be familiar with this carbohydrate. So like I was mentioning, for Jonah, the top carbohydrate researchers, for 8 years, they looked at all different types of carbohydrate sources, different grains, rice, tapioca, barley, different types of starches. And ultimately, what they found was that starting with a non-GMO cornstarch and putting it through a very specific cooking process actually yielded the best results in terms of blood sugar management. So basically, the way the starch is cooked, it's just cooked with heat, water, and pressure, no chemicals, no enzymes. It's completely natural. The way it's cooked actually significantly changes the structure of the carbohydrate and causes it to break down slowly and steadily over time. So for Jonah, now he's able to take in a significant amount of this, roughly about 120 grams, which is 4 packets of UCAN prior to sleeping at night. And this keeps his blood sugar steady for 8 hours. He's almost 14 years, or I should say he's almost 15 years old now. And really, when he started doing this in 2008, it was really an unbelievable stress relieving discovery for the family. They were able to feed him this super starch prior to sleeping at night, and he would just get that steady and even consistent burn of energy that kept his blood sugar steady. But then we started wondering, what would happen if we gave this to athletes, or gave this just to general folks that didn't suffer from this condition? Because, everybody wants to manage their blood sugar, whether it's for health, whether it's for just everyday energy throughout the day, or certainly whether it's for athletic performance. If we can manage our blood sugar levels, then we don't have to fuel as frequently. We don't worry about the highs and lows and the potential for bonking. It's the ideal situation. So Michelle, as we kind of put this to the test prior to coming out in sports nutrition in 2010. We wanted to test our superstarch against maltodextrin, which is what most of these newer sports nutrition products were using as their more complex carbohydrate. what happened, and what are we looking at on the graph when we did that test?
Yeah, so as you can see, maltodextrin is the blue line, with superstarch is the red. And so, they had people either take the maltodextrin or the superstarch, and what they were looking for was how does it affect your blood sugar over time? Because ideally, we want the most stable, consistent blood sugar, because you have to remember that your body is very, very sensitive to insulin. So with maltodextrin, you see this really big spike in blood sugar. So that's going to cause your pancreas to release insulin, shutting down your body's ability to utilize fat for fuel, and then you're going to have that crash. Once again, as soon as you have that crash, you're most likely going to want to take some sugars or something else to get your blood sugar back up. Well, what they found with the superstarch was, they were able to take the superstarch, and yes, you do have a very small rise in blood sugar, but it's not a big enough rise to shut down your body's ability to utilize fat for fuel. So you're still able to burn fat for fuel while you're getting that consistent backbone of carbohydrate. So the carbohydrate's breaking down at exactly the rate your muscles can use it, and you're utilizing fat for fuel. It's like the best of both worlds.
So that's really kind of what launched us into sports nutrition. When we saw this was working very, very differently than the maltodextrin, it was kind of that aha moment that made us realize, hey, this is something that's keeping blood sugar steady without having to dose over and over and over again. Because as many of you can see with the blue line on the graph, when the blood sugar drops about 30 minutes in, this is that signal to your body that, hey, I need to refuel. So in a typical situation, somebody going out for a run, when they experience that big crash, they're gonna immediately get that spike back up again. And Michelle, like you talked about, when you're constantly doing that, you're causing these rises in your insulin levels, or you're not as effectively allowing your body to burn fat. So you spoke a little bit about the insulin, but maybe you can speak to it a little bit more based on this graph.
Yeah, sure. So this was a test they did at the University of Oklahoma, and they had cyclists take either the superstarch or maltodextrin. You can see right before exercise and then immediately after exercise. And they had them cycle at 70% of their VO2 max. And you can see this huge rise in insulin with the maltodextrin. Basically, as soon as they took the maltodextrin, blood sugar rose and of course insulin rose. And then you also see a smaller rise, but still a rise at the very end of the exercise with the maltodextrin. Now, the really neat thing is with the superstarch, the red line, there's just a very, very small minimal line, so it's barely causing any insulin response. So superstarch is basically flatlining the insulin response. So the cyclists are getting that steady, consistent energy. Once again, they're going to have that carbohydrate backbone coming in, and they're going to be utilizing fat for fuel. They're not going to be getting those blood sugar spikes and crashes.
So this is really the key with UCAN, and as we were talking about it before, it's not that we're suggesting to run without carbohydrate or that you don't need any carbohydrate to train, but UCAN is really the best of both worlds. It's what Michelle just said. You're getting a slow and steady release of carbohydrate that doesn't spike your blood sugar. Therefore, you're able to minimize that fat storage hormone insulin, and you'll be able to burn that perfect mix of fuel, both carbohydrate and fat. And the analogy we use all the time is that UCAN really turns your body into a hybrid car, and it really offers you the best of both worlds, that steady release of carbohydrate that doesn't mess up your ability to burn fat. So this is extremely beneficial from a performance standpoint, because as you improve your ability to burn fat, you're less carbohydrate dependent throughout the duration of your runs, and you're less prone to bonking. And then, like Michelle talked about, if there's a body composition or a weight loss goal in mind, which is something that so many folks struggle with if they're relying on these fast acting sugars or these highly processed carbohydrate foods, UCAN is going to allow you to really achieve that body composition goal by acting like that hybrid car and letting you burn those mix of fuels. So we've set the background, we've talked science. Let's now speak in practical terms about how exactly to use UCAN in your training as you're getting ready for your marathon or your half marathon event. We'll start with the UCAN SuperStarch, the drink mix, which comes in a variety of flavors. And so one of the biggest things about UCAN is that it's going to be a shake type of consistency, and you want to think of it much more like liquid food rather than a sports drink you sip on during exercise. So with a given serving of UCAN, rather than putting it in your bottle and just slowly sipping on it as you run, you're actually thinking of this as the pre-exercise snack, something you take in about 30 minutes prior to your run, and something that you're really replacing, the banana or that energy bar or the bowl of cereal, those traditional fast acting carbohydrates, you can replace it with the UCAN. Michelle, when you were first trying UCAN out, I mean, I'm sure this whole idea of let me take in my nutrition all at once before, and then I don't have to fuel as much during. I'm sure it was kind of counterintuitive to what you had learned. How did you first start experimenting with this and figuring out what worked for you?
Yeah, so I heard information very similar to what we're talking about today, and as I stated at the very beginning, I was very skeptical. So, but I had a few packets, so I figured, all right, I'm going to give this a try. And I should also mention that I do have a very sensitive stomach, so that was something I was really concerned about. Especially, they said you should take UCAN, about 30 minutes before, and I was like, oh my goodness, here we go. So, I mixed it in a very small amount of water. I had the packets and I did a full packet and waited about 20, 25 minutes and I went out for an hour run. And normally when I'd get back from my hour run, I'd feel like, ooh, I need some calories, I need some water, I don't feel great. And I was surprised how good I felt. So I said, wow, I feel like I could keep running. But I thought, well, maybe this is a fluke. I'm gonna do a workout. So the next day, same thing before workout, and I was just amazed by not only how good I felt during the workout, but also after the workout. That seemed to be for me personally, where I really struggled was towards the end of longer workouts, towards that, 50 to 70 minutes, and certainly during longer runs. And so my final test was I'm going to do a 90-minute run. I'm going to take this before, and I'm going to try to not have anything during, because I would always have a Gura gel about 50, 55 minutes. And that's when I was sold. When I got back from my 90-minute run, and I still felt like I could keep going, I was like, all right, I need to find out more about this because this is something truly special.
And I think what you said, one of the things you said, Michelle, it's so true. You know, we're a society or a culture, I guess, that we're conditioned to think of energy as like taking something in, whether it's sugar or caffeine, and feeling that jolt or that buzz pretty immediately. You know, so a lot of the sugar-based types of products you almost view as catch-up nutrition, right? You start to feel crummy during your run, and you take it in because it's going to give you that instant gratification. What's kind of interesting that you mentioned is with UCAN, it's that consistency and energy you feel during the run, but because your blood sugar is not going all over the place, it's also how you're feeling after the run. You know, instead of feeling completely run down and depleted, and where you might just want to just kind of lay on the couch and do nothing, or just cram a ton of carbohydrates into your body and kind of sabotage the workout. With UCAN, it's a much more consistent and controlled feeling of energy, and I think that's a great point that you were getting at over there. A couple other kind of just logistical quirks with UCAN. So, one of the things in terms of actually mixing it is a starch, so it's not something that's going to dissolve in water. So you do, if you are somebody that's texture sensitive, you do want to just give it a good hard shake in a shaker bottle. Now, it's no different than any type of protein powder, or if you're a shake person, you're probably not going to blink an eye. But that is one thing to think about with UCAN. Giving it a good hard shake, and using cold water as well will definitely make the difference. Now, another thing you talked about, Michelle, is a lot of people might think, oh man, I have to drink 12 or 16 ounces of fluid prior to my workout. How's that going to work logistically? Am I going to have to go to the bathroom, or am I going to have that sloshy belly feeling? But UCAN's different in that sense, right? From the
Yeah,
scientific standpoint, can you talk a little bit about why with UCAN you're able to kind of tweak the amount of water you want to use to your desire?
sure, absolutely. So, well, first of all, something to think about with UCAN, like you had mentioned that it's, the consistency is thick. It's a starch. It's not a sugar. For reference, maltodextrin. Maltodextrin weighs about 2,000 grams per mole. This is just how they measure the weight of molecules. I mean, UCAN weighs 500,000 grams per mole. It's a really, really big molecule, and that's what makes it work and makes it effective. So that's why, I mean, it has to be that thick. Like that's part of the purpose. But also, bigger molecules empty from your stomach much quicker. So it's in and out of your stomach within about 20 minutes, and that's why it's so easy on your stomach, which is so wonderful for any of us that have had any type of GI issues or GI distress with, granola bars or bananas. But yeah, as far as the water goes, what I found that um, by mixing it with just, a minimal amount of water, just enough to where I'm going to be able to, drink it and it's not too thick for me. I have, zero issues. It's not like a maltodextrin or something that's going to upset your stomach if you don't get, that 6 to 8 ounces of water. So I consistently mix mine with only about probably between 4 to 6 ounces, and I'll do a scoop or a scoop and a half, and I've had no issues. So that's been really nice.
So that's something that you can very much customize kind of based on the taste and consistency you prefer. Now, the second bullet point here, I've got a question about that in terms of the serving size. So the packets contain roughly, 130 calories per serving. The tubs is more about an 80 calorie serving size. So a scoop and a half from a tub equals a packet. And, the reason we kind of did this is because the tubs were originally intended more for daily use. So there was a lot of people that were doing 4 or 5 mile runs and or going out there for an hour of exercise, and they were kind of thinking, hey, is that packet too much? And one of the big benefits of UCAN in terms of using it in your training is really using it consistently, because whether it's more of like a speed workout and a shorter workout, or whether it's a long run, keeping your blood sugar steady is critical for any type of workout, both in terms of the energy you feel during and that energy you feel after. So simply the idea with the tubs was to create a serving size that people would feel comfortable using more and more consistently, because they just might not need that entire packet. So basically, the way we think about it is that a scoop from a tub is good for about an hour, and a packet is good for about 90 minutes. As we talk about using UCAN during, we'll explain where this comes into play, but that's really one of the ways that you want to think about the difference between a packet and a scoop. So the beauty of UCAN for a lot of you folks running a half marathon, one of the big beauties is you could have, if you're anywhere in that hour and a half to 2 hour range, you could have a packet before a half marathon, or you could have two scoops even if you're closer to that 2 hour range before your half marathon, and all you're really worrying about is water on the course. Michelle, is that something that you've done for half marathons and experienced? Can you speak to that?
Yeah, I have. And it's, looking at, if you're brand new to UCAN and you look at the fact that, a packet only has 130 calories, I mean, that seems like such a crazy concept. Like, how can I have 130 calories before I run and be able to run 13 miles? But once again, you have to realize, kind of what we talked about before. It's not the calories, but it's how does it affect your body? Because you're going to get that backbone of that carbohydrates and still be burning fat for fuel. If you're not able to burn fat for fuel with those fast acting sugars, you certainly need a lot more calories. But yeah, my last half marathon I did, I use either if I have the tubs, I'll do about a scoop or a scoop and a half, or I'll just use a single packet, shake it up about 30 minutes before, and I find I'm good to go throughout the entire half marathon, which is fantastic. I've been pretty lucky to run mostly in areas that aren't super hot. I did a half marathon out in Las Vegas last year, where I took in some electrolytes on the course, but other than that, I've just used plain water, and it's been great.
Now, Michelle, you mentioned that idea that even you found it hard to believe, initially speaking, that how can such few calories sustain me for so long? And I think that's something that a lot of people come to the table with when they're first introduced to UCAN. And one of the biggest things you can do, mistakes you can make with UCAN, is trying to do a calorie for calorie match to other types of fuels, because you simply don't need as much. And actually, for some people, over consuming, UCAN, or over consuming any type of, high molecular weight or complex starch, consuming too much of it at once might result in some GI discomfort. So, you're taking in more than you probably need, and you might put yourself at risk of getting some belly aches. So really, this comparison chart shows a lot of what people are experiencing with UCAN. And I like the quote at the bottom from Dr. Kathy Eckel, who studies the human metabolism at Yale. And she says it's really the ability to maintain blood sugar that sustains energy levels. From a fitness standpoint, UCAN is huge because it does that without putting lots of calories on board. It's really beneficial because you can make every calorie count. So if you think of that idea, a lot of the calorie recommendations for these traditional gels and sugar-based fuels are not because you need to replace what you burn. It's really, they're suggesting you take in that amount of those products in an effort to sustain or to keep your blood sugar, from falling too low. Because we saw in that initial graph, with that one gel, within 30 minutes, your blood sugar is dropping tremendously. And what do you need to do? You need to raise it back up. Otherwise, you're going to start to feel fatigue, or you're going to bonk. And so that's really, the idea with UCAN. If you can sustain your blood sugar without having to keep taking in calories just to raise your blood sugar back up, then you're able to get by on a lot less. The second point is with UCAN, like we already talked about, because you're able to utilize more of your fat calories, you're simply not as carbohydrate dependent. So again, with the sugar-based gels and a lot of the sugar-based fuels that are requiring frequent consumption, it's because they're causing you to burn significantly less of your own stored fat for fuel. But we've always thought of calories for that reason primarily as what we're intaking. But if you're able to burn more of your own stored fat for fuel, like with UCAN, then those total calories that you're getting are still relatively the same. You're just getting more of them from your own internal fat stores, which I think everybody can get behind that idea. Now, Michelle, in terms of the use of UCAN during, as we look at the screen and see, one of the ways to carry and transport UCAN during a long training run or during a race. Can you just speak to the overall strategy that you like to go by when you're using the UCAN, the SUPERSTARCH drink mix that we're talking about, the same product that we're talking about using pre? What's the strategy that you use when it comes to using this during?
Yeah, I mean, if you're somebody who's super fortunate and you have an elite table or something, this may not apply to you, but most of us are going to be, carrying our nutrition with us. So what I found is, I didn't want to carry like a water bottle with UCAN. So what I did is actually, you can you could use either a packet or just use a scoop of UCAN and just mix it with a very small amount of water. A lot of people will use an ounce or a couple of ounces, and just keep adding a little bit till they get the consistency they want. And just put it in a small plastic baggie. Or you can see on the very far right, they also have gel flask and other things like that. But I found, I would just put it in one of those snack baggies. And, if you have a place you can keep it in your shorts or, as a female, I can just stick it in my sports bra. It was super simple. I just, when it was time to take the UCAN gel, I would just pull it out, kind of bite the bottom off, and take it like you would any other guru gel. And this is something I would definitely recommend you do in your training because, the UCAN is a little bit starchier. So I would usually do that like around a water table so I could just to get this kind of starch feel out of your mouth. But yeah, I found once I practiced a couple of times, it was super easy to do.
And Michelle, I think with the last thing you said is a great point. With a lot of the gel products, if you look at the back of the label, they recommend a certain amount of water, but they're recommending you consume that fluid to aid digestion. Michelle just nailed it. If you're taking in UCAN in a concentrated form, you don't need that additional water for digestion. But from a practical standpoint, it'll help you wash it down, and it'll help you get some of that starchiness out of your mouth if you're mixing it real thick. So it's a good strategy in terms of timing it. Now, this is just one suggestion in terms of how to consume UCAN during a run. You could certainly mix it up with a thinner consistency. I mean, if you run with a fuel belt, sometimes people will have a serving in each of their fuel belt flasks, and they'll mix it with more like 6 or 8 or 10 ounces of water. That's also okay, but one of the things to consider is that just like we talked about UCAN as liquid food prior to the run, it's that same idea during your run. So again, this is not intended when you're taking this in during to be a hydration type of product that you're sipping on. You're trying to get this in, ideally, get a given serving in over the course of a mile or so. So if you're able to mix it thinner and you can still do that, then that's perfectly fine. Or if you just like to mix it thicker and get it in like a gel, that also works. Now, in terms of how you time the dosing, again, it's the same thing we talked about. If you're going to do a scoop, which is good for about an hour, then you can simply do, a scoop 30 minutes before. Then once you start running, do a scoop every hour. So, you're doing a scoop 30 minutes before, a scoop an hour in, a scoop 2 hours in, 3 hours in, and so on. You can also use a larger serving size at once. So, that applies both to pre and during. So let's just think in terms of packets. If you're doing that packet size serving 30 minutes before, then that's going to give you roughly about 90 minutes. So then you can do that second packet 90 minutes in, the next one 3 hours in, the next one 4.5 hours in, and so on, depending on how long you'll be out there for your given race. Michelle, there's also the idea of loading up with even more prior to your run. Have you tried that? And how do you decide, when you should take in even more before a long run?
Yeah, and this is something just like anything else I would recommend people experiment around a little bit and practice with. I found, I can take 2 scoops of UCAN and be good on like an easy run for up to about 2.5, even a little bit longer than that, 2.5 hours or above. When I'm, running at a bit of a faster pace, I like to, um, when I did my marathon, for example, I would have 2 scoops of the UCAN about a half hour before, and then I would have a serving at mile 10 and mile 18. So, and I would just have a 1 scoop serving. But yeah, I've worked with people that, especially who, triathletes or some marathon runners that will have up to, 2 packets, even 3 scoops, and depending on, your weight and, your tolerance. Some people can even do up to, 4 scoops before, and then, not have to dose until a little bit later on in the race.
So that's kind of something that's really up to personal preference. So if you like the idea of taking in more up front and then having to fuel less frequently, then certainly go with the approach of taking in more. If you're somebody that just either can't consume that much up front or just mentally likes the idea of fueling more consistently throughout your run, then you can try, the approach where you're taking smaller amounts of UCAN at, more frequent intervals, perhaps. And that really, like Michelle talked about, is personal preference. It's something you should practice in training, something you should figure out, what you're more comfortable with, and then just make that decision based on what's right for you. One more thing to consider with UCAN, Michelle, you might have some feedback on it, but we talked about the sugar-based fuels as catch-up, so-called catch-up nutrition. With UCAN, because it's a slower carbohydrate in terms of the way it breaks down, you want to be a little bit ahead of it. So, for example, if that given serving you're taking prior to your run lasts you 90 minutes, then you probably want to take in that next serving during your run at about that 70-minute mark. So, you're not waiting like a gel until you feel that low and then expecting it to spike you back up, within a few minutes. It's something that you want to time, and kind of back time based on how long that given serving works for you. And again, this speaks to the importance of, practicing with it in training. But Michelle, I mean, how hard was that for you to figure out? Were you able to kind of figure that out within a few runs in terms of how you wanted to
Yeah.
time the dosage?
I was, and I mean, that's a really good point. And as I've used, you can over time, I've been using it for several years now. I found that I don't know if this is a great marketing thing for you guys, but I actually need less because my body has become more efficient at utilizing fat for fuel. So I found I don't even need to use it as frequently as I did before, which is really cool. But, I found out very quickly that, you don't want to get behind it. When I went for a 3-hour run, and I had 2 scoops of UCAN before, and I waited till about 2 hours, to try to take another scoop. And I was doing an up tempo run, and I didn't feel as great towards the end. I felt like this I could have done a little better. And so the next time I did that, I took the UCAN earlier. I took it about I believe it was about 80 minutes in versus 120 minutes in, and felt significantly better. So yeah, the take-home message is this isn't a fast caffeine sugar product to where you take in 5 minutes, it's going to spike you and crash you. This is something that you want to take it before you would start to feel like you're coming down.
The other thing with UCAN as we move to a different product now with the UCAN Hydrate to consider is electrolytes. So the UCAN Superstarch that we were talking about, that does have electrolytes. It has roughly the equivalent amount of sodium and potassium, to a typical gel product. But one of the catches with UCAN, like we've talked about at length, is because you're using less of it. If you are a really heavy sweater, or if you're training, in extreme heat, you might need to supplement with additional electrolytes, and that's where our UCAN Hydrate product comes in. So UCAN Hydrate, it's does not have the super starch in it. It's a 0-calorie electrolyte replacement with no sugar. So it's got a higher concentration of sodium than our regular UCAN, our UCAN super starch. Plus, it's also got potassium, magnesium, and chloride and calcium as well. So it's got the 5 essential electrolytes that you lose when you sweat. And this is something that you can fuel with the UCAN Superstarch at those specific intervals, and then the UCAN Hydrate you can just sip on as an electrolyte replacement, rather than something like Gatorade where you don't need the unnecessary sugars. Is this something, Michelle, that you've utilized in your training or racing? And if so, when have you found the need to supplement with additional electrolytes?
Yeah, so I certainly, this is something I use when the weather gets warmer. When I trained up in Portland, when I lived in Portland, Oregon, I found I didn't need this as frequently during my training. I was really fortunate to be training in a place where, the weather was often in the 50s and 60s, even during the summer months if you got out early in the morning. Now that I live in Colorado, it can get pretty hot pretty quick. So this is something that, when I take UCAN before I run, if I'm running under about 2 hours, I mean, this is all I use. I have a fuel belt and I'll have one of the bottles with water and one with the UCAN hydrate. And I really like how it tastes. It's such, as a dietitian, I'm always trying to get people just to drink more water in general. And a lot of people don't like water, so it's really nice to have a, no sugar, healthy product and no artificial sweeteners or anything like that. Something that's easy on people's stomach that's just in general going to encourage them to drink more water.
So we've talked about the UCAN Superstarch and the UCAN Hydrate, which are the two products that are going to be served on course at the Navy Air Force Half. So I'll just take a quick minute for those of you on here that are running the Navy Air Force Half, just to give you an idea of how you can expect things to work there on race day. So the UCAN, the super starch, is going to be served pre-race, and it's also going to be served between miles 5 and 6 on the course. So if you're showing up there early, we'll be out there mixing it up, and you can drink either 1 or 2 servings of UCAN before the race starts. Now, we're talking scoops here, so one serving is going to give you about an hour of steady energy. A second serving is going to get, if you take in the 2 servings before, then that's going to give you about 2 hours of that steady and consistent energy. So, when you're training with it, see how much you like to take in before, and based on your time and how long you're going to be out there, for many folks, you might be able to take those 2 servings and just worry about hydration throughout the race. During the race, the UCAN is going to be served between miles 5 and 6 on course. So if you're somebody that, for whatever reason, didn't take it before the race, this would be a good time to take in a serving to carry you through that back end of the race. And if you're somebody that took just one scoop, before the race, then you might be getting to that mile 5 or 6 point, somewhere around that hour mark, and you can take in that second serving at this point, at that point, and that should carry you through most of the way to the end. Now, the UCAN Hydrate, the electrolyte product we just talked about, that's going to be served at every water stop. So that's something that you can just kind of grab a cup of on an as-need basis. Remember, this is not going to give you any energy. This is just going to give you the electrolytes that you need to replace, especially, at DC, if it's going to be hot and humid, then you might want to make sure you're grabbing a cup of the UCAN Hydrate at every water stop. Now, in terms of a differentiation between the two products, you'll be able to tell pretty quickly. The UCAN Hydrate, it dissolves in water. It's going to be same consistency as any type of electrolyte beverage, and it's not going to be more of that shake-like consistency. So again, this is something I can't stress enough. It's not going to give you energy. You may think that this is like Gatorade, but remember, there's no sugars in this. So if you're not taking in the UCAN Superstarch and you're just taking this in, then you're going to need to figure out something else in terms of getting the calories you might need for the race. So that's kind of what we're doing at the Navy Half, and don't worry, guys. We'll be pushing this type of information out plenty of times between now and the race, which is still 3 months away. In terms of the last UCAN product, Michelle, that we'll talk about, the UCAN with protein. This is what a lot of folks are using for recovery. There's some other uses of it as well, but specifically from a recovery standpoint, how do you use and encourage people to think about the UCAN with protein?
Yeah, I'm a huge fan of the UCAN with protein, because you have that same blood sugar stabilizing carbohydrate, but now you have a whey protein isolate as well in there. And whey protein isolate is one of the highest biological value proteins out there. So it's really going to start to help your muscles rebuild. A lot of people that I've talked to are like, oh, don't I need a lot of sugar or a high glycemic carbohydrate? But, the idea is if you've kept your blood sugar nice and stable throughout your run, then you certainly don't you don't need to spike your blood sugar. Those products were made for, thinking that your blood sugar was going to be really low after a run. So yeah, as soon as I'm done with my run, it's the first thing I grab. I'll have either a scoop or 2 scoops depending on how long I ran, and I notice it keeps me nice and stable until I'm able to get my next meal. And I also work with a lot of people who will make it, they will make it into a full meal. They'll use a couple scoops, they'll use some nut butter, they'll use some almond milk, a little bit of, low glycemic fruit, and that makes, either a great, post-workout smoothie or even, a healthy meal replacement later on in the day.
And one of the big things, there is that thought of replenishing your carbohydrates, within 30 minutes after your workout, in addition to giving you the protein for muscle recovery. But unless you're somebody that's doing back-to-back workouts in a given day, like most of us don't need that big influx of sugar immediately after a workout to replenish our carbohydrate. We can do it with the more low glycemic, steady release of carbohydrate like UCAN offers, and that'll replenish you in time for your next workout the next day. So, that's one of the big things to consider with UCAN and how it's so different than something like chocolate milk, because, the disadvantage of getting that big spike of carbohydrate after your workout is, again, you're going to get that sugar spike and that insulin spike, and you're going to limit your fat burning ability post workout. And Michelle, I know you've seen it as much as I have. You go to group runs where people are training for a marathon, and then after it's done, they might just be slamming, the energy bars or the bagels or whatever it may be. And this is probably more than anything what really sabotages weight loss and fitness in marathon training or half marathon training, wouldn't you say?
Yeah, what you have before you run and what you have after you run are, two of the biggest things, especially if you're doing, a relatively short run, anything, between, say, 30 minutes and an hour. And it's amazing to me that people going on, say a 30, 40-minute run think that they need, carbohydrates before, and as soon as they're done, oh, I got to get the Gatorade and the energy bars. You basically have just, yeah, like I think the sabotage is a great word you used. You basically have just stopped your body once again from burning fat, and you've just given it an influx of sugar.
So one thing that I like to point to, because I think, well, a lot of us can relate to this, even though it might be, you might think initially like, oh man, how can I relate to Meb? So, Meb Keflezighi, winner of the 2014 Boston Marathon, and he just is going to be running the marathon for the U.S. in the Olympics coming up here in about 6 weeks for the fourth time in his career. Now, Meb's, 41 years old, so as he's gotten older and older, nutrition's been a huge factor in allowing him to have longevity in the sport. And it's been kind of really interesting to see. Meb was the first athlete to use UCAN back in 2009 as he was training for the New York City Marathon when we didn't even have a product. And in terms of recovery, one of the big things that Meb's found, UCAN is the first thing, that UCAN with protein that goes into his body after he, in that recovery period. And with Meb, I think as his mileage has gone down as he's gotten older, he's not running 140 or 150-mile weeks anymore. His nutrition has been something that he's really relied on to keep him lean. So being able to run less mileage, but then having something like UCAN post workout, which supports that continued fat burning, that's been a huge factor in him being able to maintain that leanness and race weight, and supporting his workouts. So that's the big thing I tell folks. Like, we're not saying UCAN's magic. If you're sitting on the couch and drinking UCAN, the fat's not going to magically melt away. But when you're training and you're able to surround your workouts with UCAN strategically, that's where you can really see an incredible result in terms of fitness. And then in terms of UCAN for energy, for again for Meb as he's gotten older, and I'll bring this back to kind of what a lot of us may be feeling, but as Meb gets older, his recovery routine again has become a lot more involved. So when he's done with a long run, he is hitting the gym, he's going to therapy, he's not sitting down and getting that meal in him right away. So again, even that idea of SUPERSTARCH that's in the UCAN with protein that's delivering that consistent and steady energy after a run, it's really able to tide Meb over for a couple hours so he can get through his post-workout routine. And then when he sits down for a meal, his blood sugar is still steady. So he's not, just gorging on breads and pasta and rice and things like that. It's a much more controlled feeling of hunger. And the way the general person might be able to relate to this is, we're all trying to train in many cases around our family, around our job. And you might not have the luxury, after a long run, say on the weekend, to sit down and have an ideal breakfast right away. You might have activities with your kids. You might have different family obligations, or even training, during the work week. If you're getting up early and training, you might have to get home and go straight to work. So the UCAN with protein is something that can really work well in terms of tiding you over in between meals. So that's another way, outside of just the protein for recovery. I want to stress really, really also unique about the UCAN with protein is the fact that it has the super starch in it, and it's providing you with that steady blood sugar and that steady energy. Michelle, we're pretty close to wrapping things up here, but just the last product I want to just talk about with in terms of UCAN is the UCAN snack bars, which are relatively new, and actually it's not pictured here, but we did come out just the last week with a new coffee flavor of the UCAN snack bar that uses a vegetarian protein rather than whey. So for all you folks that may have an issue with lactose or are vegan, the UCAN coffee bars are now a great option for you. But how have you mixed the UCAN snack bars into the training routine, if you have, Michelle?
Yeah, no, I absolutely have, and I think this is a really great product because also I find a lot of people, especially during the day as a snack, they like to eat. You know, when I would work with clients or even myself in particular, I often would have like a scoop of the UCAN protein with water, around 3 or 4 o'clock, kind of that between lunch and dinner to keep me nice and steady. But this product is just, it's really fun. It tastes great, and I noticed, if I have one of the snack bars, say around, 2 or 3 o'clock, it definitely keeps my energy nice and steady until dinner. And sometimes depending on if I've got things I'm doing after work or if I have a second workout, I may not be having dinner till 7:30 or 8. So this is a fantastic product for stable blood sugar and energy. It's once again it's easy on your stomach. And it's so much better than the typical snack bars like a granola bar or any type of energy bar have a lot of sugar and a lot of fast-acting carbohydrates. So you have the super starch, the coconut oil, you're gonna have a little bit of fiber in there and the whey protein. And actually, yeah, I just got to try the coffee bar, the new one that has a vegan protein, and it's fantastic. So I've had a lot of people ask me if we're gonna come out with a vegan option, so I'm really glad we have that. Is that available now commercially?
That is, yep. The coffee bar,
Wonderful,
we just launched it on
fantastic.
our website, and we've got a lot of retail stores starting to bring it in. So if you have been getting your UCAN from a local retailer, you can let them know if you're interested in that, or they might be carrying it here very soon. And that's something that we will be continuing to develop more bars with the vegan protein source in it as well. So, like Michelle talked about, this is something that in some cases you could substitute for the powder before a run and see how that works. We've generally found people saying that a bar is relatively equal to a scoop of UCAN in terms of the energy it gives them. So about that 60 to 75 minutes of energy. And then some of the coffee bar as well as the cinnamon bar that's pictured here. These ones don't have a chocolate coating on them, so they hold up well in the heat. So even if you're somebody that wants to cut it up into pieces and just from a satiety standpoint, especially if you're training for a marathon and might be out there for 4, 5, 6 hours, it's definitely something that you can cut up into pieces and just kind of chew on along the way if you can handle that during your run. And I've had a lot of people tell me that approach has worked well too in terms of preventing some of that mid run hunger. Um, Before we sign off here shortly, I want to see if I can just bring on one more person here, just to quickly just share one more perspective on how she started training with UCAN. So I'm going to see if I can get Jen Schumacher on the line here. Let me see. Jen, are you with us?
I think so.
Hey Jen, how are you doing? Jen, please introduce yourself. Jen's a running coach out in Minnesota, and we'd love to hear your perspective on how you were introduced to UCAN and how you've been using it.
All right, excuse me. So, I was actually introduced by Varen probably 3 or 4 years ago, and had a lot of GI issues prior to using UCAN, and I was at one of the Lifetime 20-mile runs, and he said, "You got to try this." So, I tried it out for a 15-mile run the next day, did a scoop beforehand, and went out for my 15 miles. Felt great. So I was immediately hooked, and I've kind of, over the past few years, changed a little bit how I use it. But now, kind of my go-to before a long run, before a marathon or a half marathon, is about a scoop of the cinnamon and about a quarter to a half scoop of the vanilla protein. And I'll do that for half an hour before. Anything under 18 miles, that gets me through. For a marathon, I'll do another combo like that about halfway, and then I'm great. I did try something different over my last training and actually took out some of the cinnamon bars while I was doing a long run. And for example, I did a 50K last spring and actually did, my typical before and then ate the cinnamon bar during a 50K, and that was all the fuel I needed. Um, and like others have said, on the long runs or hotter runs, I do take the hydrate with as well, so I'm getting some electrolytes in, and I feel great afterwards. I used to be that person afterwards who grabbed every food in sight and kept eating, and now I feel great. I, can wait and find myself a decent meal afterwards, or, I'll grab one of the protein bars now. The coffee bar is amazing, and eat one of those after a long run, and I'm fine for a few hours.
That's awesome, Jen. That's a great perspective. And one of the other things I wanted to ask you, you've also, in addition to having the bars during your exercise, you've dabbled. Correct me if I'm wrong, with making the UCAN into a concentrated gel type of form during your runs as well. Is that correct?
I did for last fall, and I actually didn't go so well. I tried to make it on the course. So um, now I'm actually going to try to make it beforehand and use that on my long runs. I'm just kind of starting back to marathon training again. So I'm going to try to make the gels so that I can just carry it with me. Because sometimes, otherwise I try to have somebody waiting at a certain point of the course so I don't have to carry it. But I'm definitely going to try the gels again. It worked good, but not, it was kind of a mess to mix it on the course.
Absolutely, and I'm glad you said that. That's a great point. So I think definitely with the way the UCAN powder is, it's fluffy. Pre-mixing it, and you can pre-mix it up to 48 hours in advance. So even if you're making that gel, mixing it at home, then transferring it into your, whatever flask you're using to carry it, that would be ideal. But Jen, hey, really appreciate your perspective. Glad that it's working so well, and I think it's great. Another thing that you offered, mixing the UCAN along with the UCAN with protein, in terms of a pre-workout fuel. That somebody else had asked that question. I'm glad you addressed that. That's totally fine and can help prevent satiety during your run. So what Jen was doing there, combining the two, is also a great solution. But Jen, thanks so much for hopping on here, and thanks so much for sharing your feedback.
Yep, no problem.
So Michelle, with that, as we wrap it up, any final takeaways that you think, we've gone here for a little over an hour, but just one or two more minutes. Any final takeaways that you think people should have when they're starting to train with UCAN?
Yeah, I guess just two things real very quickly. I think, the fact that I think it's a very good general guide that, one scoop for an hour activity and one packet for about 75 to 90 minutes of activity. I would use that as a starting point and kind of from there, figure if you need to go, a little more, a little less. And then also I really hope everyone who's listening to this tries UCAN. I feel like we have this great information and this science, but what really matters is that you actually try it and then experience it for yourself.
Absolutely. That's a great point. We can talk about blood sugar and we can talk about, the science, and it might all make sense, but really the true power of UCAN is when you're going to use it to fuel that workout, and you'll really, it's that UCAN feeling that we talk about. You'll really be amazed by that consistency and evenness in the energy you feel. And, the beauty of UCAN is hopefully it takes thinking about nutrition kind of out of the equation. That's really the idea with UCAN. When you're really feeling that steady and consistent feeling of energy, then you're able to focus on, your pace and, execute your race plan. And you're not kind of always thinking about what do I need to take 20 minutes from now. And you're not riding that wave. So with that, I just really want to thank everybody for being on here with us today. Michelle, it's always super fun to do these with you, and your perspective is much appreciated. So thanks so much for joining us.
Absolutely. Thanks again for having me.
And for all you, if you were only able to listen to some of this, or you want to review some of this information, this is all going to be available to you by email. So you'll be receiving a full recording of this session, in the next few hours later this evening. And you'll also have my email where it'll be coming from. So feel free to reach out with any questions, any training tips. We can definitely point you in the right direction if you want to kind of tweak the way you're using UCAN. So for Michelle Hearn, I'm Varun Sriram. I want to really thank Jen Schumacher for coming on with us as well and sharing her perspective. Thank you so much, everybody, for giving up your time. Thanks for everybody who asked all these great questions, and we hope to see you out there on the race course. Take care.